Moen, serve as Director of Interfaith Action. It's my delight to welcome everyone to this final in our series of 3 programs on refugees. You may recall we began with an overview of refugee resettlement, US policy, and local Michigan issues relative to refugees. And then we drilled down by looking at Syria as a case study and a humanitarian global disaster, and the impact it has had on displacement within Syria, as well as refugee flows outside of Syria. So tonight we continue that case study review of Syria. And before I turn it over to my colleague, Kathleen Hogan-Garrett, who is the facilitator for this evening's program, let's pause for a moment of reflection. Holy One, we are grateful that you are consistent with open arms of welcome to all people and at all times. Equip us to build a world that is a common home for all. A common home that even when people are displaced, they know that there will be others who welcome them to a place called home. May we work for such a future. So be it. Kathleen.
Thank you, Sid. So welcome to our second program in the Syrian crisis study that we're doing. We had with us 2 weeks ago, we had Shadi Martini, who is the director, the executive director of the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. And we learned a lot about the complex situation in Syria. But in particular, we learned a lot of what we can do. He gave us some action steps. So I encourage you to go back to everybody who was on that got shared information about what to do. But essentially he shared with us a list of actions that we can take to influence policy in the United States regarding Syrian refugees admissions, which were effectively eliminated in the Trump administration. Other things to do in the way of advocating for resources and funding to support US refugee resettlement organizations, and right here at home, what we can do to help influence and encourage our Southwestern Michigan community to welcome refugees and assist in their resettlement. So now, then we got an opportunity to spend time with Dr. Wendy Pearlman's book, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria, documenting the story of refugees and Syrian refugees. And now we've got this privilege of having her with us so we can learn more about her work. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna have her do a little bit of an intro, and she's gonna read some things to us, and she's even gonna share with us some work that she's undertaking right now, another book that she's working on. So what I'm gonna do is just do a quick intro, Wendy, or Dr. Pearlman. It's hard for me not to say Dr. Pearlman. It must be those university days. Dr. Wendy Pearlman is the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence and the Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University. Her interests include comparative politics, specializing in the Middle East region, and she's conducted research from Europe to the Middle East and Israel and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And she's a fluent, so when you read the book, you know for sure she's a fluent Arabic speaker. And she's the author of 4 books. The Occupied Voices, Stories of an Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, Violence and Nonviolence in the Palestinian National Movement, of course, the book that we're going to talk about this evening. And then another one about, triadic coercion? It's triadic coercion, which Israel's targeting of states that host non-state actors, for you political scientists out there. And so she, as I mentioned, she's going to share with us, she's writing a fourth book, and we're going to be excited about this because, again, it's about the Syrian refugees. And so we're so grateful for your time. We're going to have her with us until about 6:15, and then we'll get a chance to talk amongst ourselves a little bit. And so with that, you have the floor, Wendy. Thank you very much for taking your time during your very busy schedule with college students at Northwestern.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this kind, generous invitation. Thank you so much for having me. And for those of you who've had a chance to read the book, thank you so much for giving of your time and your heart and your mind to engaging with these stories. It means a ton. It means a ton to me, and I think also to the people who are featured in the book. So briefly, as you know from the introduction, if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, as was said, I'm a professor of Middle East politics. I've been studying the Middle East since the mid-1990s. I began studying the region during a college semester abroad and got hooked and have been doing it ever since. And when in 2011, with the Arab uprisings and the Arab Spring, which is now undergoing its 10th anniversary, so we're seeing lots about that in the news, like all regional specialists, I was just captivated by these shows of people's power and people going out into the streets and demanding freedom and dignity and accountability and better governance and human rights. And as people's attention looked throughout the region and protests flowed from Tunisia to Egypt to Bahrain and Yemen, many in Syria themselves and people said about Syria that there would never be an uprising in Syria, that people were too intimidated by a history of state violence, the regime was too strong, the repressive apparatus too willing to use force against its people, that Syrians wouldn't rise up. And when Syrians did, as you see in the book, in the tentative steps, went out in demonstrations, and those spread over space and were sustained over time, I, watching all this, from my computer screen in Chicago, was just captivated by the sheer courage it must have taken for people to go out and protest and take the risk, perhaps risking their own lives, to demand better for themselves and their communities. And I really wanted to know how people mustered that courage and broke the barrier of fear to go out and protest, and figured that there was no better way than to go and ask Syrians themselves. So that began the process of doing interviews with Syrians. And essentially I was too afraid to go inside Syria myself, and it was too risky to have frank conversations about politics inside Syria. I began interviewing Syrians who had fled the country as refugees. I began in 2012 in Jordan, and basically have gotten hooked and have been interviewing Syrian refugees ever since. So that might be one sort of interesting intersection for you all, is that I never started with an intention of interviewing Syrian refugees as refugees. I didn't care about the fact they were refugees. I was interested that they were Syrians, and I was too afraid to go inside Syria, so I talked to people who left the country. And when I first began, my interviews were very much about people's experiences inside Syria, about the revolution, about authoritarianism. And most people I talked to, that's what they wanted to talk about too. Because even though they were refugees, for the most part, especially that first year or two, most people actually didn't even see themselves as refugees. They saw themselves as people who, there was bombing in their hometowns, it was too dangerous, and they crossed the border and got out to seek temporary safety, and they were just going to wait there for any day it would be safe to go back, or any day the political situation would transform and they'd hear that the Assad regime had fallen and they would go back. So they didn't even see themselves as refugees. They saw themselves as people who just traveled temporarily and were heading back home. And over the years, I saw that change. I saw of course we're going home, of young men who'd be like, I'm not even going to buy a can opener because I have a can opener back home. So why would I invest in my exiled life and buy dishes or a can opener? I'm just going home. To slowly thinking, well, wow, a year has passed, 2 years have passed. My life is really temporary here in Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey. I'm beginning to hear stories about people who's making it to Europe. Maybe I should try to get to Europe too and get on with my life. to the same people a year, 2 years later were in Europe. And now they have children who are born in Europe. So having done interviews now for almost 10 years, I see the life cycle have overcome, and people have often come to identify as refugees, and the refugee component and aspect of their life has become more and more salient. So that's one observation, that it wasn't the moment they crossed the border necessarily they had this transformation and became refugees. It was a slow process of coming to grips with the thought that this will perhaps be longer term than they'd imagined. But my original goal, as I mentioned, was really to capture stories of uprising and protest and revolution. So I collected and collected and collected. I returned to Jordan, went to Turkey, moved on to Europe, did some interviews in the United States, and by 2015 or 16 had over 300 interviews, and wanted to put together essentially an oral history, a book that is a curation of excerpts of the interviews I did. Of course, there's a long story there about doing the interviews and finding people and transcribing the interviews and having these long transcripts and cutting up excerpts and putting them in an arrangement. But I ended up with a chronological arrangement that's meant to walk people like us, non-Syrians, through the story of the Syrian conflict, the Syrian uprising and war and refugee crisis, exclusively through the words of Syrians themselves. So it begins with stories about people's experiences of authoritarianism, about the nature of the political system that was created by Hafez al-Assad, who seized power in 1970 and rules until his death in 2000, about the authoritarian system that evolved under the rule of his son, Bashar, who took over in 2000, about the start of the Arab Spring, about how people first went out into demonstrations and how and why, and especially what it felt like to protest for the first time, how the regime responded to protests with extreme military violence, how the opposition took up arms and evolved into a militarized rebellion, the experiences of civilians living war as this multifaceted, multidimensional, multi-actor, complex war took over the country and the country itself fragmented. And then finally, how people and why people left as refugees in the beginning of their lives as refugees. So the refugee stuff is basically the last chapter of the book, which is interesting that it put it in the context of this life cycle I was capturing in people's narratives and life histories. So I'm now working on what I hope will be a follow-up book, a second book that essentially picks up where this book leaves off and probes more of this refugee dimension per se. And the focus of the book is on questions of home and what is the meaning of home as an idea or as an experience. And I've been continuing to do interviews. I'm now, since August, have been doing them over Zoom, which has been really cool. And that has in some ways allowed me to do interviews with people in places that I haven't been able to visit or more unlikely to visit. So I've done interviews with Syrian refugees or asylum seekers in Australia and Japan and Brazil and the Czech Republic and other interesting places. And for each of my interviews, as I've always done, I basically just ask someone, tell me about yourself, and try to capture their personal story, however they want to tell it. If there are things they want to say, great. If there are things they don't want to say, no problem. I don't really have any questions. I just say, tell me about your life. And I go wherever that person goes. And now at the very end of the interviews, I ask, so what does home mean to you? Now that I've seen your life, I can sort of see it in practice. And I wish that I had a clear answer to that question. I'm still thinking through all of this new mound of material. But what I can say now, as sort of my preliminary sense of it, is that there are very diverse answers to the question of what is home. Some people feel a real connection to place, whether it is the place of Syria that they left behind, to their hometown, to rivers or to trees or to
scenes and elements of the physical landscape or the neighborhoods or the streets. There are other people who say the streets don't matter, they're just stones. What matters is the people who are there. And those people are no longer there because my family is scattered and I'm scattered and my neighbors and my community are no longer there. So Syria is not really, doesn't have that emotional appeal because the people are no longer there. There are some people who say that, you know, home is family, and especially people who've been displaced from their families. There are so many, most people say there's not a single Syrian family that's whole. Sometimes a nuclear family might be lucky to be together, parents and their kids, but grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and that whole extended family that was so much a part of life in Syria, very rarely are people all in one place. And sometimes nuclear families are not together as well. So I remember doing an interview with a woman in Germany who said, I don't feel exile from Syria, I feel exile from my family. You know, I have a brother in Tunis and a sister in Turkey, and I'm here in Germany and my mother's in Sweden, and we're all waiting until the day that we get passports in our respective host countries so that we can travel and all see each other and be in the same place again. You know, some people then say home is where the heart is. I had an interview with someone who said, home is not where the heart is. He said, I'm living here in this town in the United States. My wife is here and my daughter, they're my heart. They're my greatest love. But this town isn't home. My home back home in Syria will always be my home. It's where I grew up. It's where I played soccer. It's where I knew the guy at the local store who gave me a soda for free and knew I would pay back the next day. So there's a real diversity of home as some sort of feeling of belonging, as a connection to place, as a connection to people. For some, home is security. I've had many people say, home is simply wherever I can live and there aren't bombs falling on my head. And that's it. And all of these are, I think, are of reflection or vary with who people are and their own personal trajectories, whatever it was that they experienced along the way, and the kinds of traumas that people are still sorting through, as well as where they've wound up, that some places allow for conditions for people to recreate a kind of stability and realize their aspirations, whereas in other countries, people are, you know, living with extreme economic precarity and don't have legal rights. And so for many, for example, Syrians in the border countries of Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, some are doing better, but some are quite, don't even have the privilege of finding a space where they can create a home there because their lives are in such limbo. Primarily because of the lack of a recognized refugee status that would really allow them to put down roots and find dignified work in the formal market and so forth. So I'm still collecting, still doing interviews. I'm still delighted to do an interview with anyone I can at any point. So I work through one person introducing me to another. And hope that I will put them together in a book that will still be based on voices and interviews, but will have a different kind of structure, probably fewer voices and more in-depth, long introspective narratives than this book, whose purpose was really to chronicle the events of the Syrian conflict, so that when we hear Syrian refugee, we know what these folks carry with them. Given their lives inside Syria. So with that, happy to open up to any kind of question or discussion that will be interesting for you guys.
Well, that you are just so upbeat about a very, you are passionate clearly about what you're doing, Wendy. That's where all the energy comes from. You seem like such an amazing person. Okay, so I'm going to start with just one question. Some people submitted questions online first. And I thought this one was this is relevant for our work and for your experience. So you have extensive experience and study in comparative politics in the Middle East. We're an interfaith action group that advocates for justice and peace in local and state and US policy. So we'd love your perspective. Share your thoughts on what US policy and action we should be advocating for at this time for the Syrian people, and for the rest of the players in the region. You've got a big picture So that's direct to the kind of the political nature to, our work is to influence, make a difference here locally, but really to influence and get the voices of the interfaith community involved in, get back into the political realm. And, frankly, there's a lot of interesting intersections about that and all the people that you see in Syria, the stories of people in Syria and how they really didn't have that. It's so interesting to see what we have in some ways. And so it was kind of that level of expertise that you have and what you might be able to provide us in the way of insight into that with your experience.
So this is where my optimism might begin to flounder. I mean, of course, people have different opinions, and my academic analysis, but also my personal political stance, is that the main engine of crisis and the main engine of the problem in Syria is the government, is the Assad regime, and which is a brutal authoritarian regime that has been willing to use all kinds of extreme violence to slaughter its own people and crush any opposition in order to stay in power. And a solution in Syria demands, the solution in Syria is some sort of an Assad-free Syria. This doesn't mean that US should be involved in overthrowing the Assad regime, but we should be supporting the efforts of Syrians who themselves are still trying to challenge the government. And we should not take policies that legitimate this government. I think there were times during the earlier years in the conflict when the Assad regime was weaker and might have fallen, in which more pressure from the United States could have made a real difference in the course of the war, in changing the course of the military conflict. It is a bit late at this point for that. And especially given the intervention the Assad regime from the beginning has been, propped up and supported by Iran and Hezbollah and Russia. And with the intervention of the Russian Air Force in 2015, using the massive, superior quality of its planes to bomb the last remnants and pockets of resistance and rebel-controlled territory into surrender. And the US basically has stood back and sort of watched all of this. It's difficult now to know what to do. I think there were moments where we had clearer and better options that could have made a real difference earlier. Mm-hmm. Now, for example, there is a question of reconstruction. People say increasingly Assad has won the war in the sense of the military battles and has managed to reconquer large parts of territory that had slipped from its control during the earlier years of the conflict that the rebels essentially pushed the regime out of. As the Assad regime reconsolidates its power, many say the next sort of battlefield might be that of reconstruction. The regime has destroyed huge swaths of the country. It does not have the money to rebuild. Its allies, Russia and Iran, do not have the money to rebuild. And there's an expectation that the Assad regime might look to the EU, the United States, the UN, the World Bank, sort of Western institutions to help essentially foot the bill of rebuilding. And some worry that to help the Assad regime rebuild with this way is essentially almost rewarding it for having to destroy the country and welcomes back this regime into sort of the good graces of the world as a partner and as a legitimate actor and as a party with which to deal diplomatically. And some say this is one space where a priority might be to always keep attention on the fact that this is not a legitimate regime, and any levers of pressure to coerce it to make compromises, to negotiate seriously with opposition forces, to institute any form of accountability, and should be the priority. So rather than specific, policies, I would encourage us to encourage the US government to keep in mind the need of human rights, democracy, accountability, as priorities that have to guide our policies. That might look different depending on the issue and depending on the time, because they would have looked different in 2013 than they're now going to look in 2021 about what that means in practice. So that's a bit of a vague answer. There's another really interesting issue that's been happening in the past year, and really even the past week. There have been these cases, trials in Germany of trying Syrian officials who participated in torture and made it to Germany essentially as asylum seekers. I don't know if you've heard these stories at all. There are, they're growing cases, but the case of the two figures for which have been the most attention were essentially Syrian officials who worked in prisons. One was overseeing a prison, so they had their hands totally deep in torture, and it's well known that there is widespread torture of detainees. And some Syrian refugees identified these guys, as they were fellow refugees, identified them as being involved in torture, of being essentially on the other side and perpetrators of violence. And they were arrested, and there's been a long trial in which some of these victims of torture in Syria faced their Syrian torturers in a German setting of a German courtroom and got to speak their truths. And just in the past week, one was sentenced to about 4.5 years. He was the smaller fry. The bigger fry is still awaiting his sentencing and his verdict. But there's a lot of excitement in Syrian opposition circles about these ideas of accountability, of transitional justice. There was the 60 Minutes episode a few weeks ago, if any of you saw it, about how much information Syrians have been amassing, documentation about war crimes and crimes against humanity. There's a tremendous amount of paper that documents the crimes that have been committed and who committed them. And if it is too late in some ways to turn the tide of the military battle, it's not too late to work for things and demand things like some form of justice and accountability, whether that means sanctioning Syrian officials or having travel bans or pursuing trials wherever possible. That's another principle that's very important to many Syrians. So as long as we kind of continue to take our cues from what Syrians themselves are demanding, which of course isn't a single voice or a single clear picture, but those are the voices we need to listen to in thinking about what policies to recommend. Sorry, that was a long answer because it's a complicated story.
No, I think that was perfect. That's the exact kind you provide. Actually, you might have thought it was long, but it's laser specific to your knowledge base. So thank you. Those are some big picture issues, and that's the kind of stuff that we're interested in. Because we're Americans who want to make a difference out there, and as you have been doing, and so we take some of that guidance. Okay, so I have a couple of other questions I can ask, but I am going to. You're with us for about another 15 minutes. So is there anybody else out there who has some specific dialogue? Naveen's smiling. So you go, Naveen.
Well, Wendy, I love that you're going to do a follow-up on this, because I had a lot of questions about what are they doing now? How is it like being in this new country now? And so I had a lot of questions about that. So I wanted to ask, first of all, the book was amazing. It really was. I listened to it and not read it. And then it was different people speaking. It was different actors, as it were. And I really, really enjoyed that. You were in the thick of it. And what an undertaking. You're getting all these people. How many people did you interview, for all this? Mm-hmm. Now, my question is, so you said that these people were arriving not thinking they were refugees, but could you tell us, were there different types of Syrians in whichever country you were in, whether it was Turkey or it was so if you could tell us which type of Syrian went where, if you can.
Excellent. No, great. Thank you. It's a super important question. So because my first experience interviewing was 2012 in Jordan, most of those folks didn't see themselves as refugees. And that might have been a peculiar situation. That one, most of them were people from southern Syria that was right over the border from Jordan. So they were literally sometimes, they were not traveling very far, that there are all sorts of familial linkages. So sometimes people had, cousins and families who were essentially Jordanian because they were just on the other side of a border that was drawn from one single region. So, and it was still very early, 2012 was about a year into the conflict. So that kind of population that didn't necessarily see themselves as refugees, because the political situation was also so uncertain that most people I talked to very much expected the Assad regime to fall and that they would return. They were oppositionists who rose up against the regime and expected the regime to fall, and they were going to go home. And almost any day they expected that to happen. But for sure, that's not the other people left in different circumstances at different points of time. And for sure, there might have been other people who left with every expectation that they were not going to return. And they left knowing, I'm saying goodbye. This is the last time. I'm going forever. Yeah, I would say that's a product of when people left in the course of the conflict, and in the course of whatever was happening, the circumstances under which they left. I did interviews with activists who'd been arrested and imprisoned and got out of prison and said, if I don't get out of the country real fast, I'm going to get rearrested. So again, maybe thinking they would return if political circumstances changed, but and then of course families who left under bombing and so forth. I mean, the typical pattern has been for people to leave first to a country on the borders, which is why the huge majority of Syrian refugees are in Lebanon. 3.6 million in Turkey, about 650,000 in Jordan, around 900,000 to 1 million in Lebanon. But typically most people have gone, because that's where you go by land and cross the border closest to your house and get there. And then this has been the typical pattern. Of course, there are all sorts of varieties, but and maybe stay in a country on the border for a year, 2 years, 3 years. And then if you have the means to move on, that has been typically those who then made the trip to Europe. So as we know, the UNHCR, there might be something like 1% of refugees are chosen for resettlement and resettled to a third-party country like Canada or Australia or the United States. So that's the story of maybe the refugees who are being resettled, and you guys are meeting in Michigan. But the large majority of those who've left the Middle East essentially have left illegally, sort of smuggling themselves to Europe. And of course that peaked in 2015, and we remember the pictures of the boats and the little boy, the body of the little boy that washed up in Turkey and so forth. Really peaked in 2015, and then in 2016 there's been a real clamp down on it as the EU made a deal with Turkey essentially to pay Turkey so that it would essentially man the borders to prevent illegal migration from continuing on. But those who were able to get out beforehand are now some 1 million Syrians in Europe, most of them in Germany, something like 700,000-800,000 in Germany, followed by Sweden, followed by other countries, and now many of them have been there 5-6 years and have had language training and job training, and many now, it's just the 5th year sort of anniversary of that peak of Europe, and if you Google, you'll see all the headlines are like, Germany's success story 5 years on, it's a success story of integration and so forth. But I would say that what it seems to me to be the case, I would say there's one factor that determines if people get out of Syria, if they stay in the Middle East or go to Europe, it's simply economic resources, because it costs money every single step of the way. So that the poorest of the poor are still inside Syria, because to get out, you need to be able to pay for transport. You need to be able to pay for bribes at every checkpoint when some militia group or another is going to stop, and you have to pay a bribe to move on. The countries on Syria's borders have closed their borders. Turkey has built like a 500-mile wall. To get in, you have to get out. Essentially, you have to be able to bribe. You have to be able to pay bribes and a smuggler to get you through. You can't just walk out. And then for those who went on from border countries, especially Turkey, on to Europe, it costs several $1,000s to a smuggler to get on one of those rubber dinghies or so forth, and have enough money to be able to pay smugglers and walk through and have a hotel and get yourself every step of the way, walking essentially through from Greece through Macedonia, through Serbia, through the Balkans to try to get to Western Europe. So you needed to either have money or be able to borrow it, or that was simply impossible. So I think that leads to a class differentiation, that the poor and working class folks either are in Syria or remain in the border countries, and more middle class folks who are often, university graduates and professionals who had some amount of savings are more likely to be the ones who made it to Europe. There's certainly variation and exceptions of that, but that's that I see as the major sort of pattern. Whereas many of those who've been chosen for resettlement to come to the United States are also those who tend to be perhaps poorer and more precarious situations, which is why they are selected to have a chance of a second life. So I think I see class dynamics a lot in ways that that they're not always seen. There's more to the answer to that, but that's the first cut. But yeah, certainly when people left, absolutely, I think shaped their sense of if they were going to go back, or if they viewed it as temporary or as a decisive break.
Kind of makes me wonder if we speak to the refugees leaving now, or aren't able to, or I think it would be a much more horrifying book to write, because they didn't get out 4 years ago, and everything's just a lot worse now.
Yeah. I mean, so I did the interviews that appeared in this book were interviews that I did between 2012 and 2016. Yeah, for sure. The situation now is horrible in Syria. From what people say, it's never been worse, because not only have you had now almost 10 years of accumulated war, but there's an absolute economic meltdown, that the Syrian currency is just experiencing hyperinflation. It's just lost tenths of its value. There's a COVID crisis on top of everything else. But the sheer level of economic desperation is it's terrible. From what I hear and what I read, and economic desperation in a context of lawlessness just breeds a situation in which people are literally struggling to eat, and that creates a tremendous insecurity and instability.
Let's see, is there anybody, Sue or Mike, do you guys have anything that you'd like to ask? Okay, so I
did notice Mike put a question in the chat. I don't know if his microphone works or not, so I will speak for him.
that would be great. I missed the chat.
Thanks. No, I just wanted to ask sounds like one of the threads of the narrative in your book is, you're continuing it here, is that a sense of even community has been demolished, and nation as well. I'm wondering if that's because the other has been so stigmatized, not unlike what happened in Yugoslavia, where all of a sudden next door neighbors who used to be friends didn't know one another because of the hate that was created by the government over a long period of time.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't see Syria that way. I fundamentally see it as a situation of a government that's willing to use whatever means necessary to stay in power. So I see primarily as a political conflict and a struggle for power, more than necessarily an identity-based conflict or a sectarian conflict between religious groups or so forth. The uprising itself created a tremendous amount of a sort of patriotic unity. So one theme that I think comes out in the books and other things that I have written in other forms is many Syrians said to me things like, I never really saw myself as Syrian until the revolution. Like, I always thought Assad was for Syria. And literally that was, what was written on the slogans was Assad Syria, that this country is owned by a family. And Syrians would say things like, we're just a bunch of sheep on the farm of this powerful president that does whatever he wants. And when people went out into the streets, many of them felt like they were reclaiming the nation for the people, and discovered themselves and saw neighbors and strangers all out on the streets, all chanting the same chants and calling for the same cause and helping each other. So for example, I mean, when people went out and protested and police and the army shot, opened fire in response, and people had to flee and run for safety, and people all the time talk about strangers open their doors so we could hide, or strangers were dragging people from the streets so they could get medical care, and people volunteered in field hospitals and so forth. So I think there was a tremendous amount actually of social solidarity during that moment. Now, for sure, over the years, there has been, I would think, a fracturing of the nation, but it's hard to see whether that is, the cause of violence or actually a product of violence and the effect of violence that is that shatters communities. So I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which I think there is a real a nation and community there, and we almost saw the peak of it, I would say, in the sort of the heyday of the uprisings, sort of euphoric first nonviolent phase of 2011.
Wendy, I'd just like to, it's not terribly much of a question, but thank you for writing this. As I read it, it struck on many levels. And for the first time, I again wish everybody could read it, because it gives you a very detailed understanding of what it's like to be unable to live in your home country for a variety of reasons, and to feel everything crumbling around you. And what do you do? And to make those choices. I think people would look at refugees, at immigrants differently if they really understood why you have to go. And this, and the way you did the book, it's so clear, because it's people giving their own story and saying right out loud, I didn't want to leave, but I had no choice, or I needed to do it for my family, or yeah. So thank you. And I'm really looking forward to the follow-up.
Thank you so much. Those words mean so much to me. This is precisely why I wrote the book. This is precisely to do this exactly, so that people can think, yeah, who are these refugees? Why did they leave? Who are they? It's just one case, but thank you. I feel this makes my day, because that was totally my goal.
Well, I have a quick question about, in that, all of those stories that you had to pull from, and I was really struck by how you chose to pick the doctor from Gouda's Honest. Is it Honest? Is that how you say it?
Honest, yeah.
And so and decided to use his quote about, we crossed the bridge and it trembled. And I wondered what spoke to you out of so many incredible, I mean, there's some amazing people and amazing vision, their experiences and how they put it into words. And there's some really amazing, beautiful people. How did you decide that particular spoke to you, and named your book using his quote?
Yeah. So, I mean, one, it was a back and forth with my editor. So, I mean, it began with, the book had a much drier title. At one point, it was like, I mean, I wanted to call it, To Keep Dreaming, Syrian Oral History or something. And he was like, that sounds so academic. This is not a kind of a book that, when you look at the titles of novels, that they're evocative and emotional and intriguing and often unclear. You're not quite sure what they mean. Whereas an academic title is like super dry and tells you all the information. So, I mean, I think that my editor and I both shared the idea that that the title, like the book itself, should be words that were spoken by these folks from the interviews themselves. And we went back and forth, and it was just like taking out, because a lot of the passages are amazing, but they don't necessarily all work as standalone titles, which can be 4, 5, 6 words. So we played with lots of things. Like there's one, if you remember, there's one about from a refugee in the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan that talks about like a butterfly, like a butterfly must have been really lost if it wound its way here in this desert camp. So we played around with like the lost butterfly or something. So there were things that were really great in the passages, but as a title were just very odd. So sort of, played around. And I don't know when or who it was that mentioned this one, that took that sentence. But as soon as I saw it, I think we both saw it, we were like, yes. It's one of these moments where you know when you see it, and we both thought, yeah, that works. And what I loved about it was several things. That one, it was from a happy memory, but it wasn't a memory of violence and suffering. It was literally a man remembering one of the happiest moments of his life, that there was an enormous demonstration, so many people, that when the huge crowd crossed a bridge, it trembled under the weight of so many people. So it was a happy memory, but it's also a metaphor, and it actually sounds quite ominous. Oh, we crossed a bridge and it trembled. So it's only when you read the book you would see, oh, this was actually a really optimistic memory and image. But it's a metaphor. I mean, that Syrians crossed many bridges. They crossed a bridge from authoritarianism to revolution, and revolution to war, and ultimately from their homelands to exile. And each of those bridges have trembled under the momentousness of those shifts. And I like to think that it's not just that they've trembled for Syrians, but the whole world is trembling, or should be trembling, under the weight of the Syrian conflict that has had reverberations. And if you're not trembling about Syria, then you're not paying attention. You should. Sue was like, you should be trembling, because it's. These are horrific events that have happened in our lifetime, and they should give us all pause. So it's a long story of how we got to the title, but once I identified it, I felt like it worked on those various different levels.
Well, I think that was a perfect ending, actually, so that you can get back to the work that you've got going on in a semester. And we could not be more grateful for your time. And what's great about what Sid shared with you is that this will go out in perpetuity on our YouTube page. So we're hopeful that other people will pick this up and experience you very personally in your work. And I think Sue said it all about how we feel about the work that you've done. So I know that one of the challenges I think as an American is just too many people do not know this story. And so you told it, and more people need to read it. So
thank you so much. And I'll come back with the second book if and when.
That would be great.
Let me know if you need any help with that. I'm an Egyptian journalist, bilingual. I know how to interview. I know how to transcribe. I know how to do all the things.
remember that. I remember that, because I'm always looking for transcribers, because it's basically okay. Perfect. I don't know if you. Okay, I have it.
I sent you my email in a private little thing.
I've got it. We'll be in touch.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna save the check.
Thank you so much. We're gonna let Dr. Pearlman go. If you want to stick around, we can talk a little bit more about what we thought, our experiences about this. Or oh, there she went. Pretty cool, huh?
Oh wow.
Very.
So cool. That was awesome.
Yeah. And the book is just, it's amazing. Especially reading it as we did, as we struggled with our own authoritarianism. You couldn't help but think about what if.
I am so with you, Sue. I thought about that a lot as I was reading this. But one of the things I wanted to mention, Mike, when you brought up the question of I was trying to figure out this whole issue of how I wanted to ask her a little bit more about this whole issue of how that authoritarian structure helped keep these people not necessarily fearing each other, but they just didn't know each other. From what it seemed to me, you kept hearing, you know, they kept such a tight hold as a police state that like people didn't really know the different communities very well. Like they weren't really sure they were going to be taken care of in a stranger's home. They thought they might have to fear them. I thought that was interesting. So I just thought that was kind of intriguing. I wanted to know more about how that authoritarian structure had kept people from knowing, you know, all these different, you know, because of course Syrian was made up. So if you happen to be living in the southern part of the nation, you may never have known anybody in the people who lived in the northern part of the nation. And that seemed to me like that was kind of the goal of the authoritarian structure, was to keep these people and their ideas separate so that people didn't necessarily come together, compare notes and go, this is a mess and we hate it here, all of us.
Yeah, divide and rule, for sure.
Yeah, is that, yeah, so that was kind
Well,
of.
and as Sue was saying, we've had that experience over the past 4 years, where the same kind of authoritarian divide and rule strategy was utilized.
And fear mongering. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, fear is a wonderful weapon because people will do almost anything when they're very afraid.
That's potent.
I didn't realize, and Naveen, you know more because you grew up in the Middle East, but I had no idea what a police state it really was. I had no idea that Syria was a police. I perceived them, this is how I perceived Syria, as an affluent middle class Middle Eastern nation. And that's pretty much my knowledge base. But actually, a complete police state. I mean, people were in fear constantly under the Assad regime. So, and continue to be. I just did not know. And that book gave me a complete insight into what a police state it was.
It's a police state in Egypt right now too.
No, and that's a good point.
Revolution. Yeah.
Do they do the same kind of things where they like
It's not as brutal.
Okay.
The army isn't quite like the Syrian, and it's not at all actually like the Syrian army. But right now the regime is very top down. I have friends in jail because they were political activists, and you know they haven't gone to trial for over a year. So if you knew anything at all about the Nasser regime in the 60s, that was, you know, the first president right after the 52 revolution. It was pretty much a police state then, and like now there's no dissent in Egypt. You can't, you know, say anything contrary. So
and so fear, like Mike just put, you know, that fear is how you keep people. If you say something against the regime, like you just said, then you get put in jail. And
yeah, right. If I'm, you know, Egyptians are hilarious. They have an amazing sense of humor. So they're always making these political jokes. I'm getting them on my phone and I'm thinking, should I forward this to whoever in Egypt? And I really think twice because, you know, that could get them in trouble and it's just a joke. So it's quite serious that way.
Wow. Any other, as we are at 7:25, any other things you guys want to share about your experience with this book? The only thing I want to do is thank Carly for being the excellent technician and promoter of all things interfaith. And the other thing is, shame on me for not recognizing Wednesday nights in Lent are not good nights for Christians together. Oops, sorry. So that was a mistake on my part. I'm a bad Lenten Christian, I think. And
I guess we're all guilty. Nobody's doing anything tonight.
Yeah, I'm like,
yeah, it's not your typical Lent. So
I know, but I got a lot of responses from people that I know going, oh, I'm doing the Lenten study on Wednesday night.
Pandemic Lent.
Pandemic Lent.
So our next thing is a meeting for Common Home, right?
Yeah, the next meeting is next week. So or I can't remember the exact date on it.
15th or something.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. I was gonna refer to Sid and go, do you remember the date of that? I was gonna remind everybody I didn't write it down.
It's the 16th.
16th.
Thank you,
16th
Carly.
at 6 o'clock.
Carly,
Perfect.
girl who's got the calendar.
Yes.
Is that right, Sid? You can double check.
Yes, and then the 18th, so a busy week. The 18th, Naveen will be facilitating a conversation around the book, The Beauty of Your Face, by Sahar Mustafa. So that will be another very exciting program looking at Muslim realities here in the Midwest. And I think important for us to remember as Interfaith Action of Southwest Michigan that our state and we as residents of the state do have somewhat of a profound connection both to Syrians as well as to the Arab community. Michigan hosts the second largest Syrian population in the US, and Michigan hosts the third largest Arab population in the US. So our kind of interest in Middle East, North Africa, Arabs, as well as the Muslim community are connected to our statewide realities. So an issue that we as an organization will want to be attentive to on an ongoing basis.
That's a lovely intro. I think I'll call on you on the 18th too.
Yes.
He does a good job in that department.
Great job.
Nice little-
The art.
And if you haven't started reading that book yet, it's great.
It's gripping,
I
isn't it?
highly recommend it.
And I found a profound insight into Islamic society, culture, religious, home life, as well as anti-Muslim sentiment.
I'm also going to put a pitch in here for two things. One is that we do record these. So if you're talking to anybody and you go, hey, if you want to read this and, get an experience with the author, same Naveen for your program as well, that being able to have links to, so Carly's going to do a little bit more finessing and get links up there to our YouTube channel so people can go back and read and then experience this. And then the only other thing I was going to mention in the Syrian refugee series was the idea of you being able, in some content that you can link to through the web page, to video content, in particular, a no-cost, easy access PBS program, Frontline produced. So it's on if you go to PBS Frontline's website, For Sama is an excellent documentary about a young university woman who goes to school in Aleppo, becomes a revolutionary, and then she starts working in a hospital in one of these, as Aleppo comes under attack, starts working in a hospital with friends of hers from college. And it's all about their experience of running a hospital underground, trying to save people's lives. And they're just college students and some residents and young doctors. And and so it won a number of awards. And there's a link also to some other ones if you get some other streaming services, but that one's an easy access, no cost. And so if you want to get a feel for, like Sue, when you were talking about, how Wendy's book really helped you feel like you were there. The For Sama experience gets a middle-class girl going to the university who then stays in Aleppo, has a family in the middle of this war, and her whole story from beginning to end of the rise of the uprising, and then what happens to her and her new young family in the midst of a the siege in Aleppo. So really well done. And it's all done her own narrative, her own footage. She's the documentarian. So it's pretty cool. So just a heads up about that one. And I think that's it.
Except for a final thank you to you, Kathleen, for facilitating, organizing tonight's event. Appreciate all the hard work, the multiple connections you made to make tonight a reality. So
Yeah,
thank you very much for that.
Thanks. No, I thought it was great. I got a lot out of it. I hope I'm glad you guys all got engaged, and hopefully some other people on the back end might enjoy it.